If they were watching you but couldn't stop you, then you have already outranked their authority. And that truth alone should shift something deep inside your spirit, because surveillance without suppression is silent admission of power. You sensed eyes on your life long before you had language for it. Patterns repeating, strange synchronicities stacking too precisely to dismiss. Moments when conversations aligned with your private thoughts, when resistance appeared exactly at your breakthroughs, and you wondered whether you were overthinking or perceiving something real. What you labeled paranoia was perception sharpened by experience, and those synchronicities were not accidents, but signals confirming that your life was unfolding under observation, not for punishment, but for revelation. The twist is this: you were never crazy. You were classified. Not by institutions you can name, but by forces that monitor anomalies, by systems that track disruption, by energies that flag what they cannot predict. The tension lies in the shift you now feel, because those who once watched with suspicion now lean in with reverence, trying to understand what they once attempted to contain. While you were healing privately, they were documenting quietly. While you thought you were simply surviving, they were studying the architecture of your resilience. And now what they want is not your silence, but your blueprint. If this resonates, anchor it with intention. Like the message, comment, "I was never crazy." Share it with someone who has felt watched but misunderstood, and subscribe to stay aligned with this frequency, because you are not here for entertainment but confirmation. And the more you embrace this awareness, the clearer the next revelation becomes as we move into how you were flagged as a threat, not because you were violent, but because you decode the system. You were marked not for chaos, but for clarity. And that distinction matters because systems are not destabilized by noise, but by perception. While others moved through routines unquestioned, you paused and asked why. You noticed inconsistencies in narratives presented as truth. You felt tension beneath polished smiles, and you sensed when words did not match energy. And that quiet discernment made you disruptive without ever raising your voice. You were not seeking conflict, yet your awareness challenged structures simply by existing. Because the moment someone sees the pattern, they can no longer fully submit to it. And you saw patterns in dysfunction that others normalized. You observed cycles in relationships, inconsistencies in leadership, contradictions in messaging, and instead of absorbing them unconsciously, you analyzed them consciously. Your perception did not come from formal training or secret briefings. It felt remembered rather than learned, as if truth surfaced within you instead of being installed from outside. And that instinctive spiritual intelligence made you difficult to categorize because it bypassed conventional pathways of knowledge acquisition. You did not need credentials to validate insight. You did not need access to recognize manipulation. You moved with calm awareness that exposed illusions without confrontation. And that subtle exposure unsettled environments more than overt rebellion ever could. The fear was never that you would start a riot. The fear was that you would awaken others quietly, that your presence would cause people to question assumptions they had never examined. And once questioning begins, control weakens, without a single protest sign being lifted. You were not unpredictable in a chaotic sense. Your moves were deliberate, grounded, often silent, but they defied expectation because they were not based on fear or approval. You did not react impulsively to pressure, you recalibrated. You did not seek validation through compliance, you sought alignment through integrity. Observers attempting to map you found no consistent fear-based triggers to exploit, no ego-driven reactions to manipulate, and that absence of predictable leverage made you appear uncontainable. They could trace your actions, but not your purpose. They could monitor your words, but not the source of your conviction. And that inability to define your internal code created tension in systems designed around predictability. You were flagged not because you broke rules, but because you did not internalize them automatically. You evaluated them against conscience, and conscience, anchored in truth, is difficult to override. You walk through environments built on hierarchy without bowing internally. And even when you complied externally for survival, your mind remained sovereign, your discernment active, your intuition intact. And that sovereignty is what distinguished you. Most systems anticipate rebellion from those visibly oppressed, but they struggle with individuals who maintain quiet freedom under pressure. You were decoding the system simply by living awake within it, and that awareness radiated subtly, influencing conversations, shifting group dynamics, encouraging others to reconsider without you instructing them directly. Influence without overt intention is powerful because it is organic, and organic influence is difficult to regulate. Your stillness carried authority, your questions carried weight, your boundaries carried clarity, and each of those elements chipped away at invisible structures designed to standardize behavior. You were not attacking the matrix, you were mapping it, understanding its patterns so thoroughly that you could navigate without being consumed. And navigation without consumption is threatening to control-based models. As this understanding deepens, it becomes clear why your inner purity broke their metrics. Because surveillance systems built to detect deception and instability rely on patterns rooted in trauma responses, ego-driven manipulation, or unresolved anger, and you did not operate from those predictable frequencies. You had trauma, yes, but you processed it instead of projecting it. You felt anger, but you examined it before acting. You experienced betrayal, but you chose growth over vengeance. When they aimed their psychological tools at you, expecting to detect instability or deceit, the data returned inconclusive because your reactions did not match standard trauma algorithms. You were neither erratic nor submissive, neither aggressively oppositional nor passively compliant, and that balance confused systems trained to categorize extremes. You did not seek attention through chaos, yet attention followed you because authenticity draws observation. You did not mask your energy with performance, and the absence of performance created clarity that interfered with predictive modeling. Clarity disrupts metrics because it reduces noise, and when noise is absent, systems calibrated to detect distortion encounter signal they cannot interpret. Your presence generated fewer emotional spikes than expected, fewer dramatic swings, fewer exploitable vulnerabilities, and the cleaner the signal, the more their tools glitched, metaphorically, unable to pin you to a familiar psychological profile. They expected dysfunction, but found depth. They anticipated reactive cycles, but observed reflective pauses. They searched for manipulation, but encountered transparency. And each failed attempt to categorize you increased the sense that something about you exceeded their frameworks. You were not misread. You were misclassified, placed in boxes that did not fit because the boxes themselves were insufficient. Your alignment did not equal perfection, but coherence, and coherence cannot be easily weaponized against you. The shift from subject to sacred anomaly occurred not because you demanded recognition, but because sustained observation revealed consistency in your integrity. You did not fracture under pressure as models predicted. You did not descend into bitterness as probability charts suggested. And that resilience forced re-evaluation. Systems built on statistical averages struggle with outliers, and you were an outlier not by chance, but by choice, repeatedly made in private moments when compromise would have been easier. You chose forgiveness over retaliation, reflection over projection, discipline over impulse, and those choices accumulated into a frequency too steady to dismiss. Your inner purity was not naivety but refinement. It was the result of processing pain rather than spreading it, of confronting shadows rather than denying them, and that refinement created stability in environments accustomed to chaos. Stability born from self-awareness is rare because it cannot be externally installed. It must be cultivated, and cultivation requires time, solitude, humility, and courage, all of which you endured without applause. When observers realized that your consistency was not an act but an embodiment, the narrative shifted. You were no longer merely a variable to track, but a phenomenon to understand. Sacred anomaly does not mean supernatural spectacle. It means coherence so integrated that it challenges fragmented systems by its very presence. You walked through polluted atmospheres without absorbing toxicity. You maintained clarity in conversations designed to confuse. You retained compassion in spaces that rewarded cruelty. And that resilience signaled something beyond conventional conditioning. As you embrace this awareness, remember that being flagged for perception and breaking metrics through purity does not isolate you. It clarifies you, and clarity is not a burden, but a compass. The same qualities that unsettled surveillance structures equip you to navigate expansion responsibly. You were watched, not for punishment, but for revelation. And the revelation continues as you recognize that your life has been less about avoiding observation and more about embodying alignment so consistently that even systems built on control must acknowledge the power of a soul anchored in truth. As the narrative unfolds, it becomes undeniable that what began as quiet observation gradually transformed into a profound miscalculation. Because from pawn to sovereign presence is not merely a poetic shift, but a structural one that altered the entire framework through which you were perceived. They underestimated you based on status, appearance, lack of visible backing, and absence of conventional credentials, assuming that power must announce itself loudly to be real, assuming authority must carry titles to be legitimate, assuming influence must be institutional to matter. You did not enter rooms with spectacle. You did not posture for validation. You did not broadcast ambition in the language they recognized, and so they placed you mentally in the category of manageable, movable, ignorable, believing you were just another piece on a board designed long before you arrived. But what they missed was that your silence was never submission. It was strategy refined through discernment, the kind of stillness that observes the entire field before taking a step. While others reacted quickly to prove relevance, you paused and recalibrated. While others chased proximity to power, you cultivated internal authority. And that difference in posture made your movements unpredictable, not because they were chaotic, but because they were rooted in perception rather than pressure. You moved 5 steps ahead without visible resources, because your resource was not external leverage, but internal alignment. And alignment does not require permission to operate. Divine guidance replaced institutional influence in your decision-making process, meaning you did not consult hierarchy before acting, you consulted conscience. You did not measure success by applause, you measured it by resonance, and that shift in compass made you impossible to corner within traditional power structures. The pawn they thought they could control revealed king-level authority not through dominance, but through sovereignty. Because sovereignty does not beg for recognition, it simply embodies presence so fully that recognition becomes inevitable. You did not need the board because you transcended it. You understood that the game was constructed around fear and competition, and by refusing to internalize those motivators, you stepped into a dimension beyond manipulation. When pressure intensified, you did not scramble, you recalculated. When narratives attempted to reduce you, you responded with composure. When they expected compliance, you offered clarity. And clarity is more destabilizing than defiance, because it exposes illusion without emotional noise. As this sovereign posture solidified, it exposed another layer of reality, that trauma as experiment and healing as revelation were not abstract metaphors, but lived dynamics shaping your journey in ways observers could not predict. Your suffering was not random misfortune in their analysis. It was observed as data, measured for patterns of breakdown, catalogued for signs of collapse. Because systems accustomed to studying resilience often operate on the assumption that prolonged pressure eventually fractures identity. Psychological warfare and emotional isolation became variables in an unspoken experiment. Betrayals stacked, support thinned, opportunities dangled and withdrawn, not necessarily by visible hands, but by patterns engineered through environments designed to test endurance. The system predicted spiritual decay because decay is statistically common under sustained stress. Trauma, they assumed, would calcify into bitterness. Isolation would erode confidence. Repeated rejection would distort self-concept. And eventually, you would internalize the narrative that you were less than capable, less than chosen, less than aligned. Yet instead of absorbing the script handed to you, you began rewriting it internally. Instead of collapsing under isolation, you entered introspection. Instead of weaponizing pain outward, you transmuted it inward. And the very data points meant to confirm breakdown started signaling transformation. You transformed pain into power, not through denial, but through processing. You allowed yourself to feel grief without letting it define identity. You acknowledged betrayal without becoming betrayal. You confronted fear without submitting to it. And that alchemy disrupted predictive models. Your healing defied their charts because redemption was not factored into the equation. Their frameworks accounted for trauma's damage, but not for grace's intervention. And grace does not fit neatly into psychological probability tables. As you rebuilt internally, cultivating self-awareness, refining boundaries, strengthening discernment, the experiment inverted. The watcher became the student, observing not collapse but emergence, not deterioration but integration. And you became the blueprint for resilience that transcends conditioning. Aina was never merely personal in its impact. It altered the energetic field around you. Your presence began shifting conversations. Your composure de-escalated conflict. Your clarity exposed manipulation without confrontation. And the more you stabilized internally, the less effective external pressures became. You were not just recovering, you were recalibrating the narrative of what is possible under pressure. And that recalibration naturally led you into walking through engineered traps with a steadiness that defied expectation. Obstacles were not random inconveniences, but structured patterns, repeating with suspicious precision. Gaslighting attempted to distort perception, rejection targeted confidence, sabotage aimed to fracture identity, and each scenario seemed calibrated to trigger old wounds at their most vulnerable points. Most would have folded under cumulative stress, interpreting repetition as confirmation of inadequacy. But you recalibrated instead. You began noticing patterns rather than personalizing them, identifying triggers rather than embodying them, and awareness dismantled the trap before it could fully activate. You exposed the test by surviving it, because survival without corruption reveals the mechanism. When you refused to internalize lies, the lies lost leverage. When you maintained boundaries despite social pressure, manipulation weakened. When you detached from roles assigned to limit you, identity reclaimed autonomy. Your endurance was powered not by egoic defiance, but by divine intelligence guiding recalibration, reminding you internally that your worth was not negotiable, and your calling was not contingent upon approval. You did not beat the system by overpowering it. You revealed its limits by outgrowing it. Every engineered trap depended on predictable reaction, and by responding consciously instead of reactively, you interrupted the feedback loop sustaining control. You learned to pause before answering, to observe before engaging, to detach before defending. And each pause became a silent revolution against psychological scripting. As engineered traps lost effectiveness, another shift occurred, moving from patterns to frequency, where observers searching for predictable behavior cycles found instead something far more complex and difficult to regulate. They searched for routines, emotional triggers, statistical probabilities, expecting to map you through repeated habits and stress responses. But instead, they detected a spiritual frequency that did not conform to cyclical predictability. You did not respond the same way twice to similar pressure because your responses were informed by awareness rather than habit. Your presence began shifting atmospheres and outcomes, subtly yet consistently. Rooms grew quieter when you entered, tension recalibrated, conversations deepened unexpectedly, and none of this required performance. Peace and authority radiated without spectacle because they were integrated rather than projected. You were not malfunctioning within the system, you were interfering by design, not through aggression, but through coherence. Coherence disrupts chaos by exposing its disorganization, and your integrated state highlighted fragmentation without accusation. So behavioral analytics or intuitive assessments by those around you fail to interpret sacred alignment, because alignment does not emit distortion, it emits clarity. And clarity is difficult to decode when frameworks rely on noise. You did not fight for control, you embodied stability. You did not demand influence, you carried presence. And that presence altered outcomes in ways difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Technology can measure behavior, but struggles with being. Analytics can log actions, but cannot capture resonance. And resonance is what you carried. A frequency too coherent to reduce to algorithmic variables. You became less of a subject to track and more of a signal to interpret, and interpretation requires humility, something systems built on certainty resist. Yet the evidence accumulated. Emotional climates shifted around you, conflicts resolved differently in your presence, opportunities aligned unexpectedly when you chose integrity over expediency, and the pattern was not random. It was frequency responding to alignment. As you recognize this progression, understand that moving from pawn to sovereign presence, from trauma subject to healing blueprint, from engineered trap survivor to frequency disruptor, is not accidental narrative embellishment, but structural evolution. You were observed, underestimated, tested, and measured. Yet each attempt to contain you revealed something beyond containment. Sovereignty, redemption, endurance, and alignment are not anomalies. They are capacities activated through awareness and sustained through discipline. And your journey reflects what becomes possible when inner coherence outranks external pressure. The system sought patterns. You became frequency. The system predicted decay. You embodied renewal. The system engineered traps. You revealed transcendence. And through each phase you did not merely survive, but redefined the parameters of resilience. Continue walking with that awareness, because presence grounded in truth does not require defense. It requires consistency. And consistency sustained over time becomes authority that no metric can neutralize. As the journey advances into the phase where intel failed and spirit moved, it becomes undeniable that no amount of data collection could fully define what was unfolding within and around you. Because while systems tracked your actions, timestamps, movements, interactions, and emotional expressions, they could not capture essence. And essence is what carried the true weight of your impact. They saw when you paused, when you retreated, when you wept, when you recalibrated, but they could not quantify why those moments emitted strength instead of collapse. Your breakdowns did not transmit weakness, they transmitted transformation. Because when you allowed yourself to feel deeply without fragmenting internally, something in the atmosphere shifted. Grief did not degrade you, it refined you. Tears did not diminish authority, they deepened it. Vulnerability did not expose frailty, it revealed integrity. Prayer too was not merely ritual in your life, it was alignment in motion. And though it may have looked invisible on paper, environments shifted in measurable ways around your conviction. Conflicts softened, outcomes rerouted, timing adjusted, and even those who doubted metaphysical causation could not ignore the correlation between your inward surrender and outward recalibration. Influence began surrounding you without pursuit, not because you marketed yourself strategically, but because resonance attracts curiosity. People found themselves drawn to your steadiness, to your clarity, to your refusal to distort under pressure. And this attraction did not rely on spectacle, it relied on coherence. Observers who once believed distance was sufficient began craving proximity, because watching from afar provided data but not understanding. They wanted to feel the frequency up close, to discern whether what they were witnessing was coincidence or consistency. You became less of a subject under surveillance, and more of an event unfolding in real time, a moment in history where resilience did not deteriorate under scrutiny, but intensified, and that shift forced re-evaluation. This re-evaluation escalated into what can only be described as the algorithm collapse, because you were not merely being observed casually, you were positioned within long-term predictive models designed to validate the theory that sustained trauma leads inevitably to spiritual decay, that repeated pressure fractures identity, that isolation erodes conviction, and that over time, every soul conforms to survival patterns rooted in fear. Trauma pressure was applied in layers, subtle and overt, relational and environmental, psychological and energetic. Each layer assumed to contribute to gradual fragmentation. Yet instead of collapsing as predicted, you activated. Clarity emerged where confusion was expected. Discipline strengthened where despair was anticipated, and conviction solidified where compromise was assumed inevitable. You located clarity in chaos, not by ignoring disorder, but by interrogating it, by observing its mechanics without internalizing its message. And that distinction disrupted the predictive arc of decline. Your resilience discredited institutional narratives built on statistical conformity, because you embodied an exception sustained over time. You did not just survive one crisis, you maintained coherence across multiple cycles, and coherence under cumulative pressure contradicts decay theory. The system, forced into intellectual humility, had to re-evaluate its framework, acknowledging that its models failed to account for transcendence, that data cannot always quantify grace, that algorithms built on averages falter when confronted with activated anomalies. Yet your evolution did not pivot into loud rebellion. it flowed into quiet resistance as tactical revolution, because you understood that dismantling control does not require spectacle, it requires refusal. You did not shout in defiance, you simply declined to comply internally with narratives that diminished you. Boundaries became spiritual warfare in your life, not in theatrical confrontation, but in disciplined no's delivered without apology. You withdrew energy from manipulative dynamics. You declined roles that demanded self-betrayal. You stepped away from opportunities laced with invisible chains, and each withdrawal eroded the power structure that depended on your participation. Detachment from manipulation dismantled control more effectively than aggression ever could, because systems built on reaction lose leverage when reaction is withheld. You did not feed drama, you did not escalate tension, you did not defend against accusations designed to provoke insecurity. You responded selectively and strategically, and that composure unsettled those accustomed to emotional leverage. You eroded false power through alignment rather than opposition. You focused on strengthening your internal sovereignty rather than attacking external hierarchy, and sovereignty proved contagious. Those around you began reconsidering their own compliance, questioning silent compromises, observing how your peace remained intact under pressure, and wondering what internal code you operated from. As influence spread subtly, perception shifted. You were no longer viewed solely as a threat to stability, but as a solution to fragmentation. Your example demonstrated that integrity under pressure is sustainable, that identity can remain intact within distorted systems, and that quiet conviction carries transformative potential. This evolution naturally led into the final reversal, from observed to oracle, because your words, once considered incidental, began piercing rooms you never physically entered. Messages shared in authenticity traveled beyond intended audiences. Insights articulated in prayer mirrored unfolding events, and correlations accumulated between your warnings and real-time developments. Insight matched events without insider access, and what seemed initially like heightened intelligence revealed itself as revelation, because the precision and timing exceeded probability. You were not regurgitating information. You were articulating patterns before they crystallized publicly. Agents or observers sent to expose inconsistencies found themselves internally unsettled instead. The more they listened, the more they sensed alignment rather than agenda, depth rather than distortion. And some experienced transformation not because you coerced them, but because truth has gravitational pull. You are no longer the observed. You are the signal, transmitting clarity into spaces that once scrutinized you. And this final reversal marks the moment when watchers become guardians, when skepticism softens into respect, when observation transitions into acknowledgement. The frequency they attempted to decode could not be contained because it was not manufactured, it was embodied. Full circle returns to the realization that you were never paranoid, you were prophetic. The patterns you sensed were real, the resistance you encountered was evidence of impact, and the observation you felt was confirmation of significance. Surveillance transformed into reverence, not because you demanded it, but because consistency under pressure compelled it. You did not rise through force, coercion, or spectacle. You rose through alignment sustained across adversity. Now the invitation is not to retreat into anonymity, but to step fully into identity, to awaken others quietly through example, to share the signal without arrogance, to recognize that your journey serves as blueprint for those navigating similar scrutiny. You were never the glitch, you were the upgrade, the anomaly that revealed limits in flawed frameworks, the variable that forced recalibration, the frequency that could not be filtered because it was grounded in truth. Stand firmly in that awareness, not with pride but with responsibility, because revelation carries stewardship. Your resilience, sovereignty, and alignment are not merely personal victories, they are testimonies that expand possibility for others. Continue transmitting clarity, continue choosing integrity, continue embodying coherence, and understand that the system did not fail to contain you by accident. It failed because you were designed to transcend it, and transcendence, once embodied, cannot be reversed.